"I don't use guns anymore," he said, and the words landed soft as snow on the porch railing. Night wrapped the ranch the way an old blanket wraps a sleeping thing, close, familiar, threaded with the smells of wood smoke and horse. The lamplight burned low in the kitchen window, throwing a pool that caught the slow drift of flour on the counter and the varnish of a carved horse her daughter kept on the sill. Outside, the fence rails wore a film of frost. Wind moved through the cottonwoods like a hand rubbing its knuckles. He listened for the sound of the gate, the small, honest creak that meant someone had come and gone, and for the steady, slow breathing of his household, the house settling, the stove pulsing, the soft edge of a radio somewhere down the road playing a hymn that had long since lost its words. He set the line without flourish because it was a house rule, and because rules were how he kept accounts with himself. Saying it made the ledger visible. Saying it reminded him of why he had chosen that particular shame to live with, the rusty promise that felt better to carry than the dangerous ease of a loaded hand. She moved inside like she belonged to the light, small, purposeful motions that had nothing showy about them. She put mugs on a tray with the careful steadiness of someone who had arranged this domestic landscape into order, 2 mugs for 2 people. She wrapped the quilt tighter around one chair's back, smoothing the patch where the initials were stitched, the initials he had once burned into a woodblock when he was younger and thought permanence meant wood and hammer instead of decisions and silence. Her hair smelled faintly of the tack room, of leather and horse. When she laughed, it was brief and quick, and it always made him look up from whatever he was doing, because laughter on a ranch had the force of weather. It meant everything outside could wait. He watched her set the kettle on the stove, watched the way she paused to arrange a small wooden horse on the windowsill so it faced out toward the dark pasture. She humored the place with small gifts, a ribbon on the bridle, a jar of preserves with proud handwriting on the lid, a painted rock on the windowsill that said home in a looping hand. Those small things were her version of prayer. His hands were calloused, the knuckles a pattern of tracks from years of pulling, mending, and setting right what had broken. Tonight they moved automatically, a buckle coaxed back into place, a glove stitched along a seam with the slow patience of someone who had learned to fix without hurrying. He smelled the leather, the faint sour of tack oil, the antiseptic sting of sweat dried and left as memory on cloth. The barn door was latched, the horses asleep in their stalls, each animal's breath a cloud in the cold air. He checked the latch twice because that too was part of his ledger. Latches were small, trainable things. They could be agreed with. Promises had not been so easily managed.
She met his eyes when he came back inside, and in the half-light, his face read like a map someone had traced over too often, the lines of a life mapped into fine, persistent routes. He could see things in her face that he did not always see in the mirror. Softness, curiosity, the shadow of a caution that had crept in where it belonged. She moved to the sink and dried a mug while he knotted the leather throwover that kept drafts at bay. That knot felt like making a decision you had already made. His hands knew it before his head did. Outside, the countryside exhaled. He heard a low, distant roar, trucks on the county road, and thought of the town a dozen miles away where things could be paid for at a counter, and conclusions sometimes came in the form of legal stamps and signatures. Around here, people arrived by intention or accident, and it was often hard to tell one from the other until they had already been met. "I don't use guns anymore," he said again, softer, as if testing the air. The word struck a small bell inside him, the bell that chimed against an earlier life. He had said them in town once, to the man at the feed store who had eyes like rubbed brass and asked whether he kept anything for varmints. He had said them to the sheriff once, in the awkward parlance of someone trying to be better than his past. The sentence was a hinge, one side out of habit, the other swinging toward whatever he thought redemption might be. There had been a night, only fragments sometimes came in full, of a kitchen light gone wrong, of a bullet lodging in the wrong place, of a face he could not face days after. There had been a courtroom at the end with a flavor like pennies and paper, a promise that left him with a name he could not say aloud without tasting iron. He had promised then, not to the law so much as something less formal, a small insistence that the next time his boundary was tested, he would not answer with lead. If the promise was a weight, it was also a cord. He tied it around himself so he would measure against it. He did not tell her the full story. He told her the tidy, partial truth, the kind you hand on a shelf like a jar of canned peaches, preserved but not raw. She had asked once, in a way that sounded like a measurement, why? He told her because some things once done could not be undone, because living with the memory was a trade he was willing to take. She accepted that the way younger people accept a map when their shoes are new, with hopeful faith that paths can be corrected. Outside again, something broke the flat line of the night. A car light sweeping over the barn and moving like a nervous moth. The light pooled on the gravel and stopped by the end of the drive, where the road gave way to his property in a bone of white. He felt the small, immediate shift in the house, like a dog that caught scent. The girl, of course, noticed. She looked toward the window, hand still on a rag, tension threading her shoulders into alert.
The truck that rolled up was older than the men who sat in it. It had been repainted in places by hands that ran on the cheap and useful, not the beautiful. Two men got out, stretching like they had been riding too long and using the cold to wake their joints. They moved toward the porch without hurry, the way someone approaching a house on a long road might straddle their actions with routine questions, directions, water, perhaps shelter. They carried themselves like people who had practiced the habits of being polite to strangers. He opened the door before they reached the steps. Light from the kitchen spilled out and tracked over their boots, lit the dust that clung to the hem of their jeans. The one who spoke first had a voice that slid like oil over wood. Easy, practiced, the sort of voice that could sell you a chainsaw and make you believe it was a poem. "We're not from around here," he said, "just need some water and maybe a place to warm up." There is a social grammar to such exchanges, names offered, reasons given, the clock of the world measured in the exchange. He kept the lantern light below his face like a shield, light that lifts the eyes to measure truth. The man who asked for water had a smile he did not take off, just enough warmth to be hospitable, not enough to be honest. She brought the water out in a mug and set it on the railing between them. Her hands were unsteady for a beat, the mug wobbled just enough for the men to see it. One of the men complimented a carved horse she kept on the sill through the open doorway, which was the kind of comment that had no right to touch anything but words. He watched his daughter's fingers flex around the mug, the way her knuckle whitened when she held on. She forced a smile out of habit and introduced herself, because on a ranch you meet people and sometimes you measure how weighted they are by the courtesy of your own education. They talked, small words that hovered in the porch light. He listened more than spoke. The men's questions were thinly veiled surveys of the property. How many animals? Are you alone here? How often does the county sheriff patrol this stretch? And the kind of talk men who are mapping a place do to be polite while they make their calculations. When conversation moves toward the body of a land, it often means someone is trying to figure if the land is soft enough to take something from it, or if there are edges that could be used. He felt the skin of his awareness pull tight at each small measuring phrase. He answered with short sentences. People had the habit of filling silences. He did not have such a habit. His silence was a kind of fence. Once he had not kept his boundaries clean. He had thought himself a necessary force, like a weather vane that tips only when the wind demands it. There had been a pistol carved from good metal and hung above his mantle like a question he would not answer. He used it once, and after it did what it did, the barrel became a grammar he could not tolerate. He sold it, or perhaps he left it in the house of someone he had once loved. The thing was important only in its absence. The hole it left shaped his nights. The men leaned on the porch rail like men holding on to a story. Their hands rested on wood that knew a man's hands. It recognized grip and pressure and called them home. The taller one, grease under his fingernails, a small burn mark on his thumb, shifted his weight in a way that made his elbow brush by the girl's shoulder as he leaned past her. It was a casual movement in any other context, the kind of contact that people mistake for neighborliness or something unremarkable. Tonight, though, the touch tracked across her skin like a cold ping, and she stilled. The smallest things pin you to a place, the smell of tallow, a particular pattern in the quilt, the way a hand pauses before it does anything that could be misinterpreted. He felt the change in the air as if a wire had been pulled in the house. Her breath hitched, a small intake that could have been the draft. The mug slipped an inch and she caught it as if the world had moved beneath her. Her fingers were white at the knuckles where she gripped the enamel. He saw the way her jaw clenched. She did not speak. She had a rule about not making the wrong kind of trouble, learned from older, quieter hurts.
so she folded the noise of the incident into her chest. The taller man's hand did not linger in a way that would make his actions explainable. It brushed and then paused, like a finger hovering over the wrong note in a song. It could have been nothing at all. It could have been a mistake. The thing about mistakes, though, is that they cannot always be told by the same hand that makes them. They are registered by the body's ledger. Breath that catches, the way eyes look away, the small reflex to step back. He saw it all as if through glass. His first move was not outward but inward, an old shape tightening against his ribs. Memory splinters lit the room. The dry smell of gunpowder, the echo of a shot that belonged to a past life, a child's name dissolving under the harshness of a courtroom light. He thought of the promise again, those words he kept on the porch like a talisman. "You sure you don't want to keep anything tied up for the night?" a neighbor had once asked, leaning over a fence and nodding toward a hollow that once held a rifle. The neighbor's question had been casual but carried weight. It was the kind that suggested a shortcut, an easy fix. He had said no then because the no tasted like contrition, and a vow is often better honored in the moment it is made than in the moment it is convenient to break. Her hand slammed the mug down so quietly no one heard it as an act of aggression. Sound is often a traitor. It tells you things by absence. The mug did not shatter, but the movement was enough.
The taller man shifted with the sound, backpedaling a little as the body language of the porch changed from courtesy to caution. His smile thinned. The shorter man, who had been looking into the dark, turned his head toward the farm again, as if peering beyond the lambent reach of the porch light. Their conversation tightened like a noose. Words became fewer, necessary, measured. She said nothing about what had happened. She didn't need to. The ledger of a girl who had learned to live with the possibility of being measured had other accounts. She had a history of closing doors without making statements. He could count those times like small coins concealed in the pocket of his jacket. He stepped off the porch because the air had changed in the way he recognized from other nights, nights that had not been clean. He stepped forward not with the shape of an unbridled man, but with the deliberate stance of someone who had practiced the way to make a body large without making it violent. He kept his palms open because he did not intend to be the kind who starts a fight for the pleasure of it. He had no appetite for breaking people. He had only the appetite of someone who knew how small and precarious trust is. "Evening," he said. His voice was a different kind of tool. Blunt, plain, not obliging. He had learned the efficacy of certain tones over the years. Some of them called down storms less than others. The men registered him. Politeness reshuffled itself to accommodate the presence of a man who owned the land they stood on. "Just passing through," one said, the other offering the same thin, practiced excuse that had been used 1,000 times in 100 places. It was a story meant to close a door politely. She had gone inside to the sink and leaned her shoulder against a counter as if to steady herself. Her hands were damp from washing, and the dish towel trembled between her fingers. He smelled the soap on her skin, and something older, milk and cloth, from the years when smaller hands had learned to help. He thought of how people sometimes learn to measure their safety against the reactions of the people they trust most. Memory again, light ricocheting off a floor, someone yelling a name that did not belong, the metallic clink of a shell box open like a book. He had been less careful once. Being less careful had an expense. The taller man's hand found the railing again in a way that lingered. This time it moved with intention, just the slightest irresponsible press against what the railing hid, the space between them and his daughter. It was a touch that did not belong in the ledger of good manners, the kind of touch that leaves marks not on the skin, but on the small architecture of a person's trust. Her shoulders dropped in a manner that made him feel a near vertigo. He had the sudden, terrible clarity of a man who sees a thing he had sworn would not be seen again. The ledger flashed open, and the old accounting rules rose up in him. The promise not to use a gun did not equal passivity. It meant living with all the options of restraint, with all the heavy trade-offs. He remembered a different night when his hands had been smaller and the world simpler, when a hand had reached out, and he had failed to stop the reaching by anything other than force he later regretted. He had taught himself other remedies since then, the authority of voice, the insistence of proximity, the architecture of community, tools, not bullets, presence, not distance. He moved forward across the porch boards with the sound of wood under boot.
The men's faces drew taut in that brief moment. The taller man's grin thinned to a line. The other one, his friend, met the rancher's eyes, and for a second that lengthened like elastic, both men recalculated. Maybe they read something in his face they had not expected to see, a steady, plain kind of danger that had nothing to do with firearms. She swallowed. Her jaw worked as if she had a word forming and then unforming. Her hands clenched the dish towel until the cloth creased. She did not ask him to do anything. Her body had done the asking. He did not speak either. He had always been a man that words could not fix. He put his hand on the railing and did not take aim. His palm touched wood that was cold and rough, and it steadied the small tremor in his chest. He smelled horse and old leather and the faint metallic undernote of fear. The world narrowed to 3 beats. The scrape of boot leather on porch, the almost tick of a dog turning over in its sleep, the slight intake of breath of a girl who had been touched in the way a boundary can be touched. He could have reached for what he had once used. The thought was a passing animal, quick, dangerous to name. Somewhere in the house an old gun case sat under a table, repurposed now to hold nails and spare rope. He had turned a tool of harm into something as banal as a hardware box, as if domesticity could bury guilt. That was one of his methods of atonement, conversion by hiding. But the presence of the case would not tell him what to do now. It would only be another thing weighing in the air. He stepped between the men and his daughter and the porch. His body occupied a line, clear, direct. He set his weight in a way that said he would not allow the moment to be written without his presence in it. The taller man blinked like someone remembering a favor owed. The friend shuffled his feet and glanced toward the truck, toward the open road like it might still offer them an escape hatch. The taller man stepped back and laughed too loudly, the sound cracking like a false coin. "Awkward," he said, and his voice was a cheap attempt at humor meant to smooth out any discomfort. In the silence that followed, the rancher noticed how Finley had covered the intent. "You shouldn't touch people like that," the rancher said. His voice did not shout.
It did not need to. Words can be vertebrae. They can hold up a spine. The taller man reddened in a way that could have been shame or anger. It was hard to tell in a man so practiced in not showing his hand. "You got a problem, old man?" the taller one said. The tone was a bait. There was an exchange in the air that, in another life, might have been resolved with hands and weather and loud noises. He had chosen that different life precisely to be able to answer differently when tested. The shorter man said, smoothly, "We'll be on our way. Sorry to bother you." His friend did not move immediately. He lingered in the way of men who were uncomfortable with unreciprocated challenges. She reached out then, not to touch the men, but to touch him. Her fingers brushed the denim of his coat, a small, private tether. The touch was not a plea, it was a signal, a map. He felt it like the pulsing of a wire in the dark. For a breathless second, nothing else happened. The world contracted to the pulse between his ribs. Memory knocked against him again. A courtroom, a name, a small child's laugh once interrupted by a sound that had been used to end something. He tasted metal and dust and the odd sweetness of regret. He moved then, in the simplest, quietest way he had, forward, toward the place where the boundary had been crossed. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the space between them, the only thing he felt certain he could control without breaking the promise he had made. His movements were studied, careful, built out of years of knowing how to make a presence known without escalating to the sharpness of blood. The taller man's hand went up not in surrender, but in a small reflexive warding off. The shorter man's eyes flicked over them again, measuring for whether the porch would become a place worth staying if trouble was in the carts. The truck's engine ticked in the cold, an empty promise. The night seemed to hold its breath like a horse holding its breath before a jump. Once, the sound of a shot had broken something in his house the way lightning breaks a branch. Since then, he had learned to shift his instincts into a kind of ballast. Sometimes ballast is shame. Sometimes it is the quiet architecture of a man who will stand in front of what he loves. He had not yet learned if ballast kept everyone safe, or only kept him honest to the promise he had made. He planted his feet. He let the space between the men and his daughter become a room with him in the doorway. There were 100 things he could do now. Call the sheriff,
make a scene to wake the neighbors, pull her inside and close the door. He had played each out in the quiet theater of his mind. He had also rehearsed 1,000 ways to be less violent than the man he had once been. Tonight, the rehearsal met the real stage. The taller man's jaw worked. The air tasted of old leather and cheap tobacco.
For a heartbeat, the men's faces read like pages in a book he had once studied, titled with small lies and the braces of excuses. Then the taller man stepped back. The shorter man followed, and for a second it looked like they might walk back to their truck and drive away, because the world sometimes obliges the boundary it has shown. But then the taller man's glove brushed the railing again. Just another look back, the sort of lingering men do when they want a last word to the world that has called them out. The brush was like a stone skimming the surface of water, small, insistent. It threw ripples. He moved without thinking then, or perhaps thinking all the way through, and the action was not a thing of glory. He stepped forward, closed the little distance between the taller man and the porch in a single measured movement, and took the taller man's wrist in his hand. He did not squeeze, he did not twist. His grip was an assertion meant to inform, not a lesson meant to bruise. The taller man's eyes flew wide, as if surprised to find a boundary in place that would not be ignored. "You don't touch my girl," he said low, and the words were not a threat so much as a statement of fact. Around them, night stayed still in the way it does when a thing has been stated plainly. The taller man jerked his wrist the way a man might flinch from a sudden spark. The friend swore and reached toward the truck as if to take flight. A sound rose from down the road, an old dog barking or a truck cough, and the world moved again into motion. He did not know in the moment his hand enclosed another wrist, whether he had done wrong or right. His memory of the gun had taught him that action lived in consequence, not in intent. This was a different ledger, a palm pressed over a small, sudden danger. It felt like both a violation of his own vow and, perversely, like a fulfillment of the promise to protect that had sat in his pocket like a hot stone for years. Her hand found his then, another touch. She did not say thank you, and she did not cry. She simply rested her fingers where she had been allowed to. In the small domestic architecture of the kitchen, this small contact was a raft. There were noises in the dark now, voices from the truck, a door slammed, boots on gravel. The taller man's friend was moving with the uncertain urgency of someone who has misread a risk and now felt its speed. The truck's lights came on, like two watchful eyes, and rolled back toward the road as tires found purchase on a rutted track. For a moment the night held the taste of outcome, like a tongue testing a fruit. He kept his hand where it was. He could feel the pulse of the other wrist, human, quick, not yet hardened by regret. He thought of the gun case under the table, converted from instrument to box.
He thought of the promise as a thing that had caused him nights, and now perhaps might cost him something else, his sense of consistency, the tidy ledger he had kept by washing out the gun's role from his life. The truck pulled away finally, the light running along the fence and then losing itself back on the road. Their tail lights were small planets in the dark as they receded. The house resumed a kind of normal that was no longer the same, as if someone had rearranged the furniture of its soul, and you could not at once tell where the shift had happened. He let the man's wrist go and leaned his shoulder against the porch post. His hand shook, but the shaking was not the tremor of victory. It was the tremor of someone who had been reminded of old mistakes and had chosen, in the smallness of a porch and the presence of a girl, to keep the promise he had made. She stood very close to him then, pressing the heel of her hand against the back of his. For a long minute, no words came. The kitchen clock ticked in the low light. He heard the slow settling of the house, as if it too were easing a breath. "You all right?" he asked finally, because that was the thing he could do that kept him honest. Ask and listen. She nodded once. Her mouth was set in the careful firmness of people who had been touched in a way that left no visible mark. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was even, which did not mean it wasn't frayed inside. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that he had kept his promise. He wanted to say he had not reached for anything that would empty the land of its quiet. He wanted, selfishly, to know that his order had held him. But words are treacherous. They can rearrange things into unrealities. So he let the silence do the work that words could not. Inside the house, the kettle began to sing with the heat that had been coiled for a while. The light from the lamp slid across the tabletop and struck the carved horse on the sill, throwing its small shadow like a guard. He put the kettle on the stove and filled 2 mugs, hands moving with the steadiness of habit. He handed her a mug without looking at her face too long. In the quiet, after a boundary is enforced, people sometimes measure their faces again and come up with new maps. He remembered, once more, the evening in a courtroom, the sound of paper being thudded down on a desk, the flat voice of a man who had told him what would be fair. He had chosen his penance and then given it form. But that night had not erased the hunger for immediate protection when the world presented itself as a threat. Promises, he had learned, are not always comfortable furniture. They sat, 2 figures near the stove, steam rising between them like a small smoke. He watched her trace a circle on the mug with her thumb, the way someone draws a plan they consult often. She seemed smaller to him somehow, and then again more certain, both things that could be true at once.
He felt a protective thing in his throat that was not pride and not bravado. It was an animal's simple need to make sure the space around a loved one remained intact. Outside, the wind came up again, ruffling the eaves. The night rearranged itself with the rhythm of ordinary things trying to pick up where they had been interrupted. He moved through a room full of objects that had histories: old gloves, a half-finished saddle pad, a tool, each of them a witness of a life built by repeated small actions. He kept noticing small details as if they had become urgent. The place where the varnish had been worn from the stair rail from years of hands going up and down. The small chip on the edge of the kitchen table where a knife had once fallen. The jar of pickles with the lid scratched by a kitchen key. These things made him feel that the world was stitched together with ordinary seams that could be restitched if one attended them. Later, when the house had quieted again and the night settled like a shawl over the property, he walked out to the barn and ran his hand along the old gun case, placed now as a keepsake for nails and spare rope. He put his palm over it and felt the dent where an old recoil had been. The ghost of a decision. He thought of the men who had come and left, and of the small displacement their presence had made to the architecture of his life. He thought about what the promise had cost him. Not a weapon, he told himself, but a particular kind of certainty about how to respond. He did not know how this would write itself into the ledger of the town. There were neighbors who would nod and say, "Well done," and others who would look sideways and say, "What would you have done if something worse had come?" He had no interest in hearing those arguments tonight. He had only the ledger in his own breast, where promises were paid and guilt was tallied. He went back inside and sat with his daughter by the stove for as long as they both needed to gather the warmth inside their bones. They did not make long speeches. They wrapped a quilt tighter and let the house breathe. Outside, the moon climbed and skinned the pasture in a thin light that made every fence post a phantom. The night seemed to be counting, as if keeping record. He wondered what the count would say in the morning. There had been other nights written into his memory like small, painful footnotes. The echo of a name he could not say, a mother who had sat in a chair and wept without blaming, a child's shoes left in a hallway. Those nights were not moral essays. They were work to be done quietly. He had chosen to do that work without certain implements. It did not mean he was without capacity. He lay awake later on, listening to the house, the way a man listens when he has been reminded he must be steadfast. The promise, no guns, sat like a stone in his mouth. It tasted of iron and salt, and oddly, of the clean smoke of a contained fire.
He thought of his daughter's face in the lamplight, and of the way her hands had been steady with a mug, even as they trembled. He did not know what the morning would bring: a sheriff's visit with polite questions, a neighbor's earned silence, the hum of gossip finding its way through the county. He only knew, with an animal certainty, that he had done the thing he had told himself he would do. He had moved, and his movement had been shaped by the lines he had drawn for himself. Beyond that certainty, the rest was ink not yet set. The ledger would have to be balanced with community, with law, with the daughter's own voice, with the memory of a promise and the need to protect. He felt the various weights of those things like different kinds of weather on his face, some warm and forgiving, some cold and cutting. A while after, when the porch had cooled and the kettle was empty, he rose and walked to the window that faced the road. The darkness there was large and open, a throat of night that could swallow a thing whole. He rested his hand against the glass and watched where the men's taillights had gone, a smear of red that was already losing itself to the country dark. He whispered again, almost to himself, the line that had become the bedrock of his new life. "I don't use guns anymore," he said into the dark. The words were both a vow and an assessment. They rolled back at him from the pasture like a far-off echo and sounded to his ear like a question. What then, in the shape of protection, would you be? He could not answer that night. He could only hold on to the small acts of the household and the steady, slow work of keeping watch. For now the house was intact, the daughter was not bruised, and the men had left. But there was a bruise none of that traded in, the bruise of boundary touched, the ledger corrected with the scratch of a rule called into being. He locked the door at last and laid his palm on the old gun case beneath the table. The wood had the coolness of a thing that had been repurposed and forgiven, but inside his chest the memory of the gun's weight remained as a measurement of what might have been. He slid the case closed and stood in the dark for a time, letting the vast, slow country night press against the thin windows. There was a price to living by a promise. He had paid it in years of quiet. Tonight he had paid it with a hand on someone's wrist, with a presence that had stopped a touch without reverting to the old mechanics of a dangerous relief. The world in which he lived was stitched by such decisions, small, often lonely, and sometimes effective. When he finally went to bed, he left a lamp burning low as a small witness. The quilt lay folded at the end of the bed like a promise made of fabric. He listened to the house breathe, and to the slow wind over the pastures. His fingers found the seam of the quilt, and he thought of how many stitches it took to hold together a life.
Outside, far down the county road, a truck's engine faded into the night. He did not know whether they would come back. He did not know if the sheriff would drive out tomorrow. He did not know if the town would debate him at the cafe in the morning. He only knew the immediate ledger. A girl safe for now, a promise intact by measure, and a question that would not let him sleep easy. The night held its breath a little longer, as if waiting for some ledger to close. He turned out the lamp and let the darkness take him, and in the dark his vows sat against his ribs, warm and heavy as a stone. Dawn arrived slow and gray, as if the sky were unwilling to commit to light. He woke before the sun, because that was the practice of men who kept places where animals and weather and clocks intersected. The quilt lay heavy across his legs. Its seams felt like the map of the small domestic repairs he'd made that season. Somewhere in the house, a drawer sighed open and shut, some small paper being moved by hands that were awake now. He listened for his daughter's step, and then for the careful clink that said she was already in the kitchen making coffee the way some people made vows, by repetition. On the porch, the frost had browned into the sharp facets of a colder morning. Tracks scarred the drive where the two men's truck had gone, two dark channels that led back to the country road and into a distance that promised anonymity. He walked to the window and watched where the marks dissolved into the larger gray of the world. The night's small rearrangement was visible in the way a gate sat slightly ajar, no longer forcing obedience on the world, but waiting for the next pair of hands to decide whether to close it. She came into the room with a mug wrapped between both hands. Her hair had been braided in a way that left soft feathers at her nape. The day had settled on her like dust, quiet and unthreatening. She moved as though she had slept enough, perhaps because sleep is elastic and finds a way even after a night that has been rearranged by contact. She did not look as raw as he feared she might. The flinch, if it lived anywhere, had retreated to the small architecture of her shoulders. They sat at the table as if starting a new ledger of the day. Neither spoke of the men at first. It felt in the tender early morning illegal to trade the quiet for a rawness that would spread. The room was a constellation of small domestic objects, an enamel sugar bowl with a hairline chip, a jar of spoons, the carved horse on the sill. He watched her thumb graze the rim of the mug, and felt an ache like weather moving through bone. There came a knock, soft, polite, the kind a sheriff uses when he wants to be a neighbor as much as an officer. The knock carried the sound of formal possibility, questions, paper, official mouths forming words that might change the shape of the thing they'd just endured.
He rose and opened the door to a man in a weathered hat whose face was both kind and tired, someone who had already made his own small reckonings with a county where grudges and favors held together households like nails. "Morning," the sheriff said, and his voice was careful as a man explaining a map. He smelled faintly of coffee and leather and the sort of days that wore uniform like a softened jacket. "You called?" the rancher asked, though he knew he had not. The sheriff glanced at the tracks and then at the porch, the way a reader skims for the important lines. "Neighbor phoned in," he said. "Thought I'd check the property, take a statement. Is your girl all right?" "She's fine," the rancher said. His voice carried the same evenness that had steadied him the night before. "We're fine." The sheriff tipped his hat slightly at her, as though politeness could put things in order. "I'll need to take both your statements anyway, standard practice. Someone touched without consent, someone reported it. I'll need details." She exhaled a small sound, almost a laugh that was without humor. "The man brushed past me," she said simply. There was no theatricality, only the flatness of a fact laid out. It made me step back. My dad, she looked at him, and he felt the small pressure, the unspoken permission to speak for herself at any point. He asked them to leave. The sheriff nodded. He moved through the house like a respectful shadow, taking notes, asking the formulations that kindly erased nuance but created a record. The rancher watched the sheriff's hands, the way the pen hovered, the way the paper accepted the story in clean, legal strokes. Words that lived in the house as tremors now took on the slower gravity of official paper. There was a moment in his memory that came in the shape of a paper falling across a desk. He saw for a blink the judge across a bench and the sound of a gavel hitting like a distant shore, an ending not of the world but of certain illusions. The echo of that gavel sat under his collar like a pulse. The sheriff asked the questions bureaucracies demand. Who was there? What was said? Did anyone threaten? Were there witnesses? He asked whether the rancher wanted to press charges for unwanted contact or assault. That phrasing hung between them like an invitation to set fire or bind it with a ribbon. The rancher thought of the wrist he had held, the smallness of the gesture that had kept a larger violation from breathing itself into their house. "I just wanted them off the porch," he said. They left. "You can change your mind," the sheriff said. "People can do this later, after they sleep." The rancher watched his daughter's face at that. There was a moment the sheriff met her eyes with a matter-of-fact patience. "It's up to you," the sheriff said softly. "I can file a report. We can take a look at their plate, see if they've been in the area before. We can try to find them."
She's indefinite. Years uncertain in the ledger, the rancher carried about what 20 meant, or 16, or something in between, that required extra care in the way people spoke around her. She said, "I don't want to go to court." Her voice had the grit of someone who had been around older people's fights. She knew how slow the law could be, how it kept you talking about the thing until the thing subsided into a dictionary entry. He wanted to press, wanting to be firm and kind in a way that did not cross into ownership. He wanted to say, "Press it." But there was a complexity in her tone that was not about weakness. It was about a calculation of cost she had learned from living with him. Legal fights bring public light and curiosities. She had already, in her life, cataloged the dangers of being enlarged in a room not your own. He swallowed something like a plea and looked at the sheriff. "She can decide," he said. The sentence was not for the sheriff, but for himself. It was a way of reminding the ledger that autonomy must be honored, even by those who love. The sheriff made his notes and left with a polite cluck and a promise to keep an eye on the road. He lingered by the gate for a second, looking at the tracks and then at the porch, where 2 mugs still steamed, as though he might determine the rightness of things by studying the residue. "If anything changes, you call me straight away," he said. "If they come back, don't engage alone." The house settled again with the sort of exhale a drum takes after a hit. They ate breakfast in a silence that felt both holy and practical. Words were small and used with moderation. Each one could shift the arrangement of trust in ways that required darning later. The day moved through rehearsed chores as a way of being human while negotiations happened in the stomach. He fed the horses and checked the fence lines, the work of the hands that had known the ledger of small things. Each knot he tied felt like an attempt to stitch a world back into a shape the size of the kitchen. He watched his daughter from the corner of his eye as she fed the horses, how she moved with the steadiness of someone who also knew how to make things hold together. Neighbors did what neighbors do. Mrs. Hobbins from down the lane dropped by with a tin of biscuits, her cheeks pink with cold. She gave him a look that was part praise and part concern, the line in the face that said both good and did you have to without the grammar of verbs. "You did right by her," she said, and the words were meant to be balm. A younger man named Devlin came by later, a neighbor who delivered hay into town. He offered a nod that was less committal, the way some men measure and then store opinion like grain. That evening the cafe in the town buzzed with small variations of the night's story.
Some versions had him a brave man, standing between predator and prey. Others had him a fool who could have ended something with a bullet and had chosen the long road of paperwork. Conversation is a kind of economy in places like this. Rumors circulate on credit until someone pays for them with clarity or silence. A few days later, someone from the sheriff's office called with a patchwork update. 2 similar trucks seen further down the county, nothing conclusive. A few reports of men asking for work in an awkward pattern, but no identification to anchor suspicion. The possibility of follow-up action was there. The phrase, "we'll keep an eye out," is a kind of neighborly promise that in this county holds some weight and some limbo. He remembered nights when promises like that were not enough. The memory came as a slice of pepper, sudden and precise, a child's amusement interrupted by a sound that belonged to the flavor of a life that was ending. He had stood in a room then, thinking he was doing right, and by right had meant something else entirely. That memory had the shape of a child's shoe on a hallway floor, a final thing that taught him the price of certain reflexes. As the weeks crept by, the immediate danger faded into the steady background of life. The men did not return. The house remained as solid as the weather allowed. Yet something in the architecture of their day had altered. She moved with less of a yield in certain rooms. When the porch light burned low, she was more likely to leave the kitchen door latched. He noticed those small changes and cataloged them the way a man might mark tree rings, signs of seasons that had skidded into one another. They began to speak slowly about protection in other ways, practical things, without mechanical detail, like a plan for who to call, an alarm that would wake the neighbors, using the old barn lanterns to create a visible border when strangers came by. He kept the list of options in his head like a prayer. None of them involved a barrel or a trigger. He had learned to make his defenses not into instruments of immediate permanent harm, but into a system of witnesses and lines of sight. Still, the ledger of promises troubled his sleep. Sometimes at odd hours he would wake and see the ghost of a gun's weight in the dark, an absence that was feelingful as a missing tooth. He put his palm over the old gun case beneath the table and told himself things that were half true. The case was repurposed. The implements were gone. He had traded one form of response for another. The truth of the space between him and the world, though, remained ambiguous. That uncertainty shaped his days like the shadow under a porch rail. There had been another memory, an apology made in a room of yellow chairs, the smell of disinfectant, the flat voice of a man who explained consequences and measured them in money.
He had been told then that intention is mercy only sometimes, and the law will not always be satisfied with the softness of apologies. One afternoon his daughter sat on the back steps, her knees drawn up, and spoke in the sort of blunt way that people do when the fog of rumination has cleared. "Why did you promise?" she asked. He considered the question as if it were a tool he might learn to use. "Because I thought it would make me less dangerous," he said. "Because I thought I could chart the horizon of my own temper and decide not to go there." She turned the mug in her hands and watched the slow curl of steam. "Does it make you less dangerous?" she asked him, eyes trying to find the seam on his face where rhetoric met bone. "It helps," he said. "It keeps me from doing something I'd spend years paying for." "And what about when you can't stop it with words?" she asked, and the question was both bright and kind. What if words aren't enough? He wanted to list 100 theoretical backups, neighbors, alarms, the sheriff's presence, but she looked like someone who wanted an honest answer. He told her the truth he had been cultivating. Then you have to be clever with your hands and stubborn with your presence. You have to make the world uncomfortable for people who would make others uncomfortable. You have to be willing to be a body in the space between someone and what they want to take. She listened and then nodded in a manner that was small and sure. There was agency in the way she folded her hands, like someone tucking away a map. She asked about filing a report later, then changed her mind, citing how cumbersome it felt. He respected that. She stayed in charge of her story, and that was the central ledger they both agreed to honor. The town's sentiment varied. A church meeting produced quiet condolences and an aged voice that prayed for protection without clarifying how God might grant it. In the grocery store, a woman said to him with a head tilt, "You did good, but you're lucky you didn't have to go further." Luck and ledger often sat side by side in small towns.
He accepted the thanks and the warnings with equal patience. Time does not erase the edges of violations. It softens them into grooves you can feel if you press your thumbs on the right place. He and his daughter visited a counselor in town, more as a precaution than a necessity. The counselor offered a way to speak about boundaries that lived outside the house ledger and a private space where the daughter could explore her feelings on her own terms. She was not defined by what had happened to her. The counselor's work was to give language to what she owned and what she chose to share. Months passed with a slow stitch of routine. The rancher found himself less haunted by the immediate urge to arm himself than he was worried about the possibility of being forced into a choice that would undo whatever progress he had made.
The memory of the courtroom still sat in the corner like a moth-eaten suit, worn, once fitting, and mostly a reminder of the man he had been rather than who he wanted to be. Then, in a night not unlike that first one, but colder, and toward the end of winter, a different phone call came. The sheriff called to say they had found a truck matching the description in a neighboring county. It had been stopped for a traffic violation, and in the course of the stop, an officer had noticed tools and gear that suggested the men had been asking properties for work under false pretenses. The county the truck had been registered in held records of complaints for similar behavior. There would be an inquiry. There might be charges if patterns matched. The sheriff concluded with a sort of hesitant optimism that is the coin of county work, might give us a lead. He felt a relief like water on parched land. The gratitude was not about vengeance, but about a form of closure. Still, the men had not been brought to any courthouse in their county for what they had done to touch a boundary. The law moved in larger gears than a porch could affect, and justice of a personal kind did not always synchronize with legal outcomes. Another memory, a room lit by half-lamps, a hand being held in a plea, the smell of hospital soap and guilt. He had learned to carry not only guilt, but the knowledge that some things could not be negotiated by absolution alone. He kept that memory close as a wrong that had taught him how to stitch better. When the sheriff came by in person with a polite update, the daughter surprised him. "I want to give a statement," she told the officer. Her voice was measured, as if she were reading something she had written earlier. "I don't want them to touch someone else." Her words redirected the ledger again. She had thought through the costs and decided she wanted the story to belong, in part, to the record that might protect someone else. The sheriff took her statement with a gravity that made it tangible. It was a step that had nothing to do with him, other than the quiet pride he felt at her agency. The reporting and its consequences were not dramatic. There were forms to fill, statements transcribed, a detective who came by to collect measurements and ask the sort of polite yet precise questions that law enforcement has learned in the long practice of cataloging events that disrupt order. The men were questioned where they had been stopped. They hemmed and hawed, manufactured reasonable explanations, and then, in the slender bureaucracy, they were matched with prior reports. Whether charges would stick was a matter of months and papers and witness statements. It was not a hero's arc. It was cold, methodical, the opposite of drama. In the cold spring that followed, a petition was drawn up in the county for restraining orders for some individuals who had harassed people across properties.
The system's wheels moved slowly, but the record had begun to tilt. For the rancher, the legal architecture felt both alien and necessary. He had learned something bitter about justice, that it moves in increments, and so any progress felt either trivial or meaningful, depending on where you sat. Neighbors who had once held opinions now showed a different variety of care. Devlin brought over extra feed and asked if he could help shore up the back fence. Mrs. Hobbins offered to sit with the girl in the afternoons when he had to drive into town. People offered small things, presents, a cup of coffee, a ride to a meeting. Those small gestures stitched a fabric that was not invulnerable, but was less alone. There were nights, months after, when memories clipped hard into him. He would wake and see again the flash of a gun and the rawness of a courtroom. But now those edges eased into the awareness that sometimes restraint could be a form of courage. He had not thought of courage as a ledger entry before. He had thought of it as a flash that might cost everything. He had been surprised to discover that you could practice courage like anything else, by doing small things again and again, until they took on the shape of habit. She returned to her ordinary life, riding horses, painting windowsills with bright colors, learning the patchwork trade of making the home livable. The touch that had been the fulcrum of the night sat inside her like a dent in a bowl, visible only when the light hit it right. She used the dent to mark a point of caution rather than a definition of herself. Sometimes, at dusk, she would walk the fence line with him and say nothing, the two of them present and unremarkable. and also in their presence to one another, guarded. In the end, there was no single closure that wrapped things into tidy moralities. The men were questioned. Some were admonished in a courthouse in a neighboring jurisdiction for misrepresentation and disturbing the peace. None of that erased the sensation of a boundary touched. What changed, in the small, ordinary way things change on a ranch, was the grammar of their lives. They swapped a tool of immediate finality for a set of practices that built witnesses into the world. Lights left on longer, neighbors informed sooner, the sheriff's phone number pinned to the fridge, a block of people who had seen and would say. The rancher's promise remained not as a pure test of abstention, but as a living thing subject to revision and context. The vow, once a hard black line, softened into a philosophy of restraint weighted by responsibility. It no longer meant, in his mind, a naive abstention from all forms of force. It meant a deliberate choice about how to meet danger with the least lasting harm possible. He told himself this in the quiet hours when the quilt lay over his chest and the pasture breathed under a moon.
There were still flashes of a face he could not meet, a hospital hall, an apology that had not been enough. Those flashes taught him how to make boundaries that had teeth without being a trigger. Months later, at a town meeting on safety, the rancher listened to competing logics, some arguing the need for armed readiness in isolated places, others promoting community watches and non-lethal options. He had come to the meeting not to speak, but to hear. When he did speak, it was brief. "I don't use guns anymore," he said, and the sentence landed in the room like a flat stone thrown into a pond. Then he added, "But I learned how to keep the people in my care safe every day with whatever works without making the world more dangerous." There were nods and questions and the essential human business of disagreement. He expected that. He had not come for unanimous approval. He had come to add a small voice to the chorus that wanted both caution and care. On a night later that winter, after a mail of small victories and quieter setbacks, he found himself in the barn after feeding, rubbing the rough line of a seam on a saddle. The old gun case rested near the workbench. It had been reduced over years into something ordinary. He opened it and looked at the nails and spare bits inside. The space that had once held an instrument of finality now held banal things. He smiled a small, private smile at the absurdity of domestic redemption. His daughter came to the barn, leaning against a post with her arms folded like someone who had learned to be both watchful and kind. "You ever regret anything?" she asked, as if the question lived in a book and she had flipped to the necessary page. "Every day," he said. "Regret is a home I keep visiting." She stepped closer, and for a moment her face was close enough to see the small light in her pupils. "Do you think you kept your promise?" she asked. He set a nail in the wood and tapped it once. "Most days," he said. "And the ones I don't, I pay attention to. I try not to make them worse. I try to be better the next day." His voice was gentle in a way that strangers might not understand. He felt the unevenness of it as a map. She nodded, then did something that surprised him. She reached into the old gun case and handed him a small, blank journal she had found tucked behind a box of screws. It was leather, worn at the edge like a thing that had been loved. "Keep the ledger," she said, "but write down the things you did that were right, too." He took the journal with a careful reverence. It felt like a new tool, useless and essential. He ran his thumb over the cover as if testing its grain. "Okay," he said, "I will." Winter melted into a slow spring, and the pasture turned green in the way seasons do when they are allowed their gradual work. The community remained a place of small stitches. There were no raptures, no triumphant declarations of moral supremacy. There were meals shared on porches, and whispered complaints at grocery lines, and the mundane business of paying a water bill. The world had not become safer because of a single night. It had acquired a new set of practices that included both caution and neighborly oversight. The ledger he kept in his chest, equal parts promise and shame, shifted its tone in quiet ways. It accepted that keeping a vow did not exempt him from the moral calculus of protecting another person. It taught him that protection could be a long sequence of small, stubborn acts,
showing up, calling neighbors, teaching his daughter to trust her own voice, learning to notice the way someone's smile refused to reach their eyes. On a late evening, not unlike many others, he stood at the gate with his palm pressed on the wood. Snow had begun to fall in a hush that the county does sometimes in March, when weather can still have surprises. The flakes settled into the carved initials on the gate, like the handwriting of weather. He looked back toward the house, where a light burned low, and he thought of how many small things keep a human life folding into another. Quilts, mugs, a hand on a wrist, the grain of a sill. In the dimness, he heard her voice from the porch. "You ever think about going back on it?" she asked. Going back on the promise to avoid guns. He considered the old sentence as if it were a physical thing he might toss into the snow. He had learned to keep promises not because they freed him from consequence, but because they shaped the way he saw himself. He had also learned the terrible kindness of being liable to his loved ones in ways that sometimes required quick, ugly decisions. The balance had no simple scale. "No," he said finally, "but I do think about what it means to protect. Protection is not just a tool. It's a habit. It's a set of persons who will not let you fall through the cracks. It's calling for help. It's holding a wrist when you need to. It's making sure a place has witnesses." She came to stand beside him, and for a moment the two of them were quiet in the falling snow. The country lay open and hungry for the morning. He kept his hand on the gate until the cold felt like something he had been given and not imposed upon him. Not using guns anymore had been a line that saved him from repeating an old ending. It had been both a vow and a wound. He would carry it as long as he lived, not as a rigid rule that made him less human, but as a moral instrument he had to sharpen with practice and humility. The truck that had once carried two men as small chances fell into another story. The county filed papers. Officers followed up. The men's histories accumulated checks and systems he did not know how to read. The legal result was never going to be catharsis. It was merely an administrative fact that let other people sleep with the thought that institutions had done what they do.
In the quiet aftermath of that, something else settled. A small certainty that the girl he loved was resilient, that she had choices and agency, that the ledger of hurt could be balanced by a ledger of dignity if people paid attention. He had intervened, and he had done so without resorting to fire. He had preserved a promise without losing the ability to act in defense of another. That was, he told himself, a kind of moral weather, shifting, complex, and never perfectly forecastable. On a late afternoon, when the sun made the fence posts into long, patient shadows, he walked the same line they had walked months before. He ran his fingers along the railings and found the faint smudge where another set of hands had once lingered. He thought of how small things leave traces, and how the work of living is often erasing and then repainting those traces. At the far end of the property, where the road bends and hides the world beyond, he paused and closed the gate with a deliberate, slow motion. It clicked into place like a punctuation mark. He stood there a long time, snow collecting on his shoulders, watching the pasture breathe out steam and watching the world hold its breath. He felt the old weight under his ribs not as a condemned stone, but as an object that could be carried and interrogated, weighed against the small acts he chose every day. He turned the gun case over with his palm one last time, feeling the nick and the old scars in the wood. He had repurposed it. He had not mythologized it. He slipped the little leather journal he'd been keeping into the case, a ledger now of small deeds and apologies, and times he had stepped between danger and the people he loved without turning his oath into merely avoidance. When he finally walked inside, he heard the kettle sing low, and she was at the stove, humming to herself a tune that had no words. She looked up and met his eyes. There was a steadiness in her glance that had been bought in difficult pieces. She smiled, not huge, but right for the room. He returned it. He set the journal on the table and touched the spine with a fingertip, as if blessing it with a promise of attention. Then he took the mug she handed him and held it between both hands, feeling the heat pass into him. At that small hearth in that small house, they had, by degrees, rearranged a life. He whispered the line again, not as a mantra, but as a fact that had been worked into the grain of days. "I don't use guns anymore." It was not a final stop, but a stance, one he would keep,
inaccessibly, with the knowledge that protection is rarely black and white. He had stood between his daughter and an intrusion without resorting to the old shape of defense. He had learned, in the slow way the country teaches, that a promise can be both a weight and a compass. Outside, the snow softened the sound of motors on the road. Inside, the lamp threw a pool of light over the carved horse on the sill. He set the mug down and ran his thumb over the book's edge, thinking of how many stitches it sometimes took to hold a life together. Small, repeated acts a person could account for. He would, that night and the next, and for as long as he lived, find ways to keep watch. He would call neighbors when unfamiliar lights appeared. He would teach his daughter how to call and when to assert herself. He would continue to make room in his life for the heavy, ambiguous work of keeping a promise and keeping people safe. Later, when someone in town asked whether he ever regretted what he had sworn to do, he would answer simply and with the peculiar kindness of a learned thing. "I don't use guns anymore," he'd say, "but I do my best to be what they need me to be, present, accountable, and willing to bear the cost that comes with protection." If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing and sharing. Let's talk respectfully about the choices people make to protect those they love.